Every war crime explained in 10 minutes. Looking at human history, it becomes quite clear that wars have almost always occurred. States have changed. Empires have risen and fallen. Technology has become increasingly complex. But one thing has remained remarkably constant. People have continued to fight each other, and at some point, humanity faced a rather strange question. Because if war is a situation where two sides try to win at any cost, a logical thought arises. Are there any limits to what can be done in war? Intuitively, it seems that there shouldn't be such limits. If the survival of a state is at stake, logic dictates using any means necessary. But over time, people began to notice an unpleasant pattern. When war has no rules, it very quickly descends into complete chaos. The methods become increasingly brutal. The consequences increasingly devastating, and ultimately, not only armies but also millions of ordinary people suffer. This is precisely why rules of warfare gradually began to emerge. Not because war has become less brutal, because humanity has begun to understand that some methods are so destructive that they must be prohibited. Today, these prohibitions are known as war crimes. And although we hear this term quite often in the news, many people don't fully understand what exactly constitutes a war crime and why. These rules exist at all, so let's get to the bottom of it. 1. Attack on civilians. One of the main principles of modern international humanitarian law is a rule called the principle of distinction. Its idea is quite simple. During wartime, a distinction must be made between military targets and civilian objects. Military targets include armies, military bases, equipment, weapons depots, command centers, and anything directly related to combat operations. Attacks against such objects are permitted, but civilians are a completely different category. Civilians do not participate in hostilities. They do not make decisions about war, do not plan military operations, and do not command armies. This is why international law considers them to be protected. History has shown why this rule proved so important. In the 20th century, wars became significantly more technologically advanced, and therefore significantly more destructive. Bombers could attack entire cities, missiles could obliterate neighborhoods in minutes, and artillery could strike over vast distances. As a result, in some conflicts, the number of civilian deaths began to exceed the losses of armies. That is why, after World War II, the international community finally enshrined the rule. Deliberate attacks on civilians constitute a war crime. Number 2. Attacks on hospitals and medical personnel. The next rule concerns one of the most important things in any war: medical care. When hostilities begin, the number of casualties rises rapidly. Soldiers are injured, civilians are shelled, and without doctors, the situation quickly becomes catastrophic. That is why international law places special emphasis on the protection of medical workers. Hospitals, field hospitals, ambulances, and medical personnel are considered protected objects. They cannot be attacked because their sole purpose is to save lives. Historically, this rule is linked to the development of humanitarian organizations. In the 19th century, Swiss entrepreneur Henry Dunant witnessed the horrific aftermath of a battle where thousands of wounded soldiers were left on the battlefield without medical care. This event inspired him to create the movement that later became the International Committee of the Red Cross. It was then that the Red Cross symbol emerged, sign intended to indicate that medical aid is being provided, not a military target. By the way, a little later we'll examine in detail the most brutal and prohibited war strategies actually used in history and still strictly prohibited by international law. You'll definitely want to see it. Number 3. Torture and treatment of prisoners of war. During war, soldiers can be captured. This happens when they surrender or are captured by the enemy. However, once a person becomes a prisoner of war, they are no longer participating in combat. They no longer pose an immediate threat. This is why international law requires that prisoners be treated humanely. This means they must be provided with food, water, medical care, and protection from violence. However, history shows that in practice, this rule has often been violated. Cases of torture, humiliation, and cruel treatment of captured soldiers have been recorded in various conflicts. Such actions are considered a war crime because they violate one of the fundamental principles of humanitarian law. Even an enemy is still a human being. Number 4. Prohibited weapons. Some weapons are considered so destructive and uncontrollable that the international community has decided to ban their use entirely. One of the most well-known examples is chemical weapons. During World War I, armies began using poison gas on the battlefield. Clouds of toxic substances spread through the trenches, causing suffocation, lung burns, and agonizing death. The effects were so horrific that after the war, countries began signing treaties banning the use of such substances. Biological weapons, technologies that can spread dangerous diseases among the population were later added to this list. Such weapons are considered prohibited because their effects are virtually impossible to control. If you're interested in learning real war stories, banned tactics, and the real rules of massacre, subscribe to the channel right now. There are more shocking facts ahead that you weren't taught in school. There are 5 use of children in war. When we imagine a soldier, we usually imagine an adult in uniform, trained and participating in combat. But in some conflicts, reality is quite different. Sometimes, people who shouldn't be there at all, children, find themselves on the battlefield. International law prohibits the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict. This prohibition extends beyond simply giving children weapons. This also includes using children as scouts, couriers, guards, or assistants to armed groups. The reason is fairly obvious. Children are physically and psychologically unprepared for war. But for some armed groups, this very fact makes them convenient. They are easier to intimidate. They are easier to control. They are easier to force to follow orders. Sometimes children are abducted from villages or refugee camps. Sometimes they are drawn into armed groups through propaganda or promises of protection. In some regions, children end up in war simply because there is no other reality around them. If a person grows up in a zone of constant conflict, weapons can become a familiar object. This is why international law considers such actions a serious war crime. Number 6. The psychological impact of war crimes. War is not just about bombings, explosions, and front lines. The most devastating consequences often remain unseen. The psychological trauma inflicted on people. When civilians witness killings, torture, or the destruction of their homes, their brains register this as a constant threat. Children who have survived bombings or looting may suffer from anxiety, insomnia, and nightmares for the rest of their lives, whilst adults may be plagued by feelings of helplessness and guilt over those they were unable to save. War crimes leave their mark on entire generations. Following mass attacks on cities, people flee to other countries, destroying communities, schools, and hospitals, leaving children without an education and families without support. Psychologists note that the consequences of such actions are felt even decades later. Entire regions remain in a state of psychological crisis, with people learning to live in fear, not knowing what the next day will bring. It is interesting that this is precisely why international law so strictly protects humanitarian corridors, hospitals, and civilians. Wars may be inevitable, but suffering must be minimized. Otherwise, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. Even a small stick figure running through a ruined city can become a symbol of how war breaks the spirit, and a reminder that any breach of the rules is not merely a violation of the law, but a trauma that lasts a lifetime. Number 7. Hunger as a weapon. War is associated with weapons, explosions, and battles. But sometimes one of the most destructive tools is not a weapon at all. Sometimes it is food, or more precisely, the lack of it. Throughout history, one of the most common military tactics has been the siege. An army would surround a city, cut off roads, and block food supplies. Sometimes such sieges lasted for months. People inside the city gradually ran out of food. Disease began to spread, and at some point, the population found itself on the brink of survival. Modern international law considers such actions unlawful if they are deliberately directed against the civilian population. This is precisely why the use of starvation as a weapon is considered a war crime. Number 8. Banned tactics. Throughout the history of warfare, people have devised the most sophisticated ways of putting pressure on the enemy. But some methods proved so brutal that they were eventually officially banned. For example, in the Middle Ages, the tactic of starving out cities was used. Armies deliberately destroyed water supplies and ransacked warehouses containing grain and food to force the population to surrender without a direct battle. In those days, this was considered a normal strategy, but for the civilian population, it meant starvation, disease, and mass mortality. And such actions would later fall under the category of war crimes. During the Second World War, the Nazis actively shelled residential areas and carried out mass bombings of cities, turning them into zones of terror for the civilian population. These crimes left a tragic legacy and, after the war, became one of the examples upon which international bans on attacks against civilians were based. Modern conflicts also have their own forbidden tactics. The use of high explosive, thermobaric and incendiary, munitions against gatherings of civilians or civilian infrastructure falls under international law, even if such munitions provide a tactical advantage. Their use is considered unlawful, and commanders may be held accountable. Essentially, these tactics have one thing in common. They do not merely kill, they inflict suffering and terror upon the innocent. And it is precisely for this reason that modern law strictly prohibits their use. Number 9. Use of human shields. Another serious violation relates to a tactic that creates extremely complex situations on the battlefield. Sometimes the military positions military equipment, weapons depots, or command posts near residential areas. The reason is rather cynical. If the enemy decides to attack such a target, there is a high risk that civilians will be harmed. And if they do not attack, the military facility will continue to operate. This strategy is known as the use of human shields. Under international law, this is considered a war crime, because the civilian population is deliberately exposed to additional danger. The rationale behind the ban is quite simple. Civilians must not be used as tools of military strategy. In summary, when people hear the term war crime, it sometimes seems as though we are talking about rare and unusual situations. But in reality, most of these rules are based on a fairly simple idea. Even during war, there are limits. You must not target civilians. Children must not be drawn into combat. Hunger must not be used as a weapon. And civilians must not be caught between armies. These rules do not make war humane. That is probably impossible anyway. But they at least attempt to establish minimum restrictions in the most brutal situation humanity has ever created.